First course students, welcome to the fifth lecture, the theme of which is Renaissance in English Literature, Elizabethan Age, Thomas More and Christopher Marlowe. Objectives. By the end of the lecture, students should be able to explain the history of the Renaissance and its main ideology, give a brief description of biographical sketch of Thomas More, and critically analyze his poem Utopia. Give a biography of Christopher Marlowe and discuss his major works. Identify major themes and forms in the literature of the Elizabethan period. During the lecture, the following questions will be discussed. The first, the Renaissance, humanism and its progressive ideology. The second, the great dramatists of the Renaissance, Thomas More and his book Utopia, Christopher Marlowe and his great works. The third question, characteristics of the Elizabethan age, the blossom of Elizabethan literature and the Elizabethan theatres. After the period of the 15th century, a new epoch in life and in art appeared known as Renaissance, which means rebirth and revival. This period was a special phase in the culture and economic development between the 14th and 17th centuries. Various events changed an intellectual and moral attitude of people. Superstitions born of ignorance and fear of the unknown gave way to knowledge. Man saw the world in a new light. Many discoveries happened at that time in many spheres of social life, as science, economy, and culture. Various fields of knowledge began to develop, especially philosophy, history, languages. They were called humanities. The writers, painters, scientists were called the humanists. The 5th and 16th centuries are the period of the European Renaissance or New Birth, one of the 3 or 4 great transforming movements of European history. The impulse by which the medieval society of scholasticism, feudalism, and chivalry was to be made over in what we call the modern world came first from Italy. Italy, like the rest of the Roman Empire, had been overrun and conquered in the 5th century by the barbarian Teutonic tribes. But the devastation had been less complete there than in the more northern land, and there even more perhaps than in France. The bulk of the people remained Latin in blood and in character. By the 14th and 15th centuries, further, the Italians had become intellectually one of the keenest races whom the world had ever known, though in morals they were sinking to almost incredible corruption. Already in 14th century, Italy, therefore, the movement for a much fuller and free intellectual life had begun, and we have seen that the Petrarch and Boccaccio, something of the spirit was transmitted to Chaucer. In England, Chaucer was followed by the medievalism 15th century, but in Italy there was no such interruption. The main ideology came into being, new thinking called humanism. The main feature of this ideology showed that the main interest lay in man and not in religion as it was before. Latin and Greek were very developed and took a prominent place in education. Renaissance firstly developed in Europe, especially in France and Italy. It was associated with Francis Bacon and Thomas More in England, Rasmus of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and Copernic in Poland. The literature as well as the fine art taught that man was not an evil as the Church had taught, but he had the right to live, enjoy himself, and develop his talent. Unlike the Church dogmas, the ideology of Renaissance taught that the happiness of man was on the earth. It depended on his own strength and mental ability to achieve it. Man was to be his own guide to truth, justice, and happiness. The actual course of the religious movement was determined largely by the personal and political projects of Henry VIII. Conservative at the outset, Henry even attacked Luther in a pamphlet, which won from the Pope for himself and his successors the title Defender of the Faith. But when the Pope finally refused Henry's demand for the divorce from Catherine of Spain, which would make possible a marriage with Anne Boleyn, Henry angrily threw off the papal authority and declared himself the supreme head of the Church in England, thus establishing the separate English Church. In the brief reign of Henry's son, Edward VI, the superation was made more decisive. Under Edward's sister Mary, Catholicism was restored, but the last of Henry's children, Elizabeth, coming to the throne in 1558, gave the final victory to the English communion. Elizabeth's skillful management long kept the majority of the Puritans within the English Church, where they formed an important element, working for the simpler practices and introducing them in congregations they controlled. But towards the end of the century and the Elizabethan reign, feeling grew tenser, and groups of Puritans, sometimes under persecution, definitely separated themselves from the state church and established various sectarian bodies. Shortly after 1600 in particular, the Independents or Congregationalists founded in Holland the church which was soon to colonize New England. At home under James I, the breach widened until the nation was divided into two hostile camps, which results more rapidly decisive for literature. From the writers sprang the first theories that later helped the people to fight for freedom. As for England, the spirit came a little later. The wave of progress which reached England was in the 16th century. Every year, numbers of books appeared in England. Many scientists came from the European countries because the universities in England were lacking teachers who could spread the new thinking. One of such scholars was Thomas More, born in 1479 in London, educated at Oxford, where he could write an excellent Latin. He began his life as a lawyer. During the reign of Henry VII, he became a member of Parliament. He was an active-minded man, kept a keen eye on the events of his time. He saw the hard life of common people and tried to change it. He wrote many articles on social and political subjects. 14 years later, when Henry VIII came to the throne, More was made the Speaker of the House of Commons. More was an honest Catholic, but he wasn't liked by church because of his writings. When Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, the Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, refused him. So Henry VIII became the head of his own Anglican Church. At that time, More was made Lord Chancellor. He didn't want this post because he was against the king's absolute power. He refused to swear to the king, and thus he was thrown to the Tower. Parliament declared More guilty of treason, and he was beheaded in 1535 in the Tower. Despite the fact that he lived not a long time, he managed to write the works which made him well known all over the world. His writings include discussions on political subjects, biography, and poetry. Utopia is written first in Latin in 1516. The word utopia came from Greek and means nowhere, but in his book it means a non-existent island. The title was chosen to show not openly the facts that took place in England at that time. The book consists of two parts. The first, a profound and truthful picture of people's sufferings. He points out the social evils existing in England at that time. And second, his ideal of the future society. It describes a perfect system built on that island, which one of the personages of the book, a sailor, had described to More. The state on the island was the Commonwealth or Republic. The author speaks of all good lords or orders on that island. There is no private property. People own everything in common and enjoy complete economic equality. Everybody cares for his neighbor's good, and each has a clean and healthy house. Labor is the most essential feature in the life, but no one is overworked. Everybody is engaged in useful work 9 hours a day. After work, they indulge in sport and games and spend much time in improving their minds. All teaching is free, and parents don't pay any school fees. For authorities, the utopians choose men whom they think most fit to protect their welfare. When electing their government, the people give their voices secretly. There are few laws and no lawyers at all, but these laws must be strictly obeyed. Thomas More says that virtuous lives according to nature. The greatest of all pleasure is health. Man must be healthy and wise. Christopher Marlowe was born in Canterbury in the family of shoemaker. His father wasn't rich to effort his son to send him to private school. He entered the Canterbury Grammar School at 14. On graduating, he won a scholarship for Cambridge University, which gave him the right to get free education after exams. At the time, the University of Cambridge was no longer a school devoted to theology. Most of the students studied Greek, Latin, classical literature and were prepared for being priests. Marlowe was interested in the classics and his translations from Greek were the best. There he attended the group University Wits. The members were influenced by the ideas of Renaissance, but at the same time they discussed also religious and philosophical questions. They were known as free thinkers. Marlowe hated religion because it cramped individuality and even he began to doubt in the existence of God. He believed in the power of strong individuality. After the university, he went to London and tried his luck as an actor, but without success. From that time, he took to writing plays. The London playwrights were his contemporaries, those university wits. Marlowe was very talented and was the first in England to approach history from the political viewpoint. It was the time when people began to think of social political problems. His main dramas are The Tragic History of Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine the Great, The Jew of Malta, Edward II. He showed his characters are very powerful individualities. He showed power from different angles. The power of knowledge in Dr. Faustus, the imperial power in Tamburlaine the Great, the power of money in Jew of Malta, and the loss of power in Edward II. They tried to use power not for the good of people, but for their own selves only. It brings them to all misery and finally they perished. The most significant period of Renaissance falls to the reign of Queen Elizabeth. England was in the peak of its prosperity. That period is known as Elizabethan era. It was characterized by the development in many fields of science, art and literature, especially English poetry. People not only from the rich families but from the middle class tried to get education. The children from middle classes managed to get education at universities. They had to be churchmen, priests, but many of them refused to become churchmen. They wanted to be writers and dramatists. These students and graduates were under great influence of the classical education. Many of them wrote in Latin and Greek. These men were known as the university wits. Among them were Christopher Marlowe, John Lilly, Robert Greene, Thomas Nash. The leader was a very famous nobleman, Earl of Leicester, Sir Walter Raleigh. He was not only a talented poet and historian, but a traveler. He was known for the free thinking. It was he who united those students. That was a new stage of development of English drama. Before there were three main dramatic genres: mysteries, episodes from the Bible, miracles from the lives of saints, and moralities of moral plays. They taught people how to live. But when the university wits appeared in character of English drama changed. The new drama represented real characters and real human problems which met the requirements of the common people. Almost all dramas were written in verse. The earlier half of Elizabeth's reign also, though not lacking in literary effort, produced no work of permanent importance. After religious convulsions of half a century, time was required for the development of the internal quiet and confidence from which a great literature could spring. At length, however, an hour grew ripe, and there came the greatest outburst of creative energy in the whole history of English literature. Under Elizabethan wise guidance, the prosperity and the enthusiasm of the nation had risen to the highest pitch, and London in particular was overflowing with vigorous life. Several general characteristics of Elizabethan literature and writers should be indicated at the outset. The first, the period has the great variety of almost unlimited creative force. It includes works of many kinds in both verse and prose, and ranges in spirit from the loftiest Platonic idealism or the most delightful romance to the level of very impulsive realism. The second, it was mainly dominated, however, by the spirit of romance. The third, it was fully also the spirit of dramatic action, as befitted an age whose restless enterprise was eagerly extending itself to every quarter of the globe. The fourth, in style, it often exhibits romantic luxuriance, which sometimes take the form of elaborate affections, of which the favorite conceit is only the most apparent. The fifth, it was in part a period of experimentation, when the proper material and limits of literary forms were being determined, oftentimes by means of false starts and grandiose failures. In particular, many efforts were made to give prolonged poetical treatment to many subjects essentially prosaic, for example, to systems of theoretical and scientific thought, or to the geography of all England. The sixth, it continued to be largely influenced by the literature of Italy, and to a less degree by those in Spain. The seventh, the literary spirit was all-pervasive, and the authors were men, not yet women, of almost every class, from distinguished courtiers like Raleigh and Sidney to the company of hack writers who starved in garrets and hung about the outskirts of the bustling taverns. The period saw the beginning, among other things, of English prose fiction of something like the latter modern type. First appeared a series of collections of short tales, chiefly translated from Italian authors, to which tales the Italian name novella was applied. Most of the separate tales are crude and amateurish and have only historical interest, though as a class they furnished the plot of many Elizabethan dramas, including several of Shakespeare's. The medieval religious drama had been written and acted in many towns throughout the country, and was a far less important feature in the life of London than of many other places. But as the capital became more and more the center of national life, the drama, with other forms of literature, was more largely appreciated by it. The Elizabethan drama of the great period was altogether written in London and belonged distinctly to it. Until well into the 17th century, to be sure, the London companies made frequent tours throughout the country, but that was chiefly when the prevalence of the plague had necessitated the closing of the London theatres, or when the other reasons acting there had become temporarily unprofitable. Concluding the fifth lecture, we can say that characteristics of the Renaissance include a renewed interest in classical antiquity, a rise in humanist philosophy, a belief in self, human worth, and individual dignity, and radical changes in ideas about religion, politics, and science. The Renaissance was a fervent period of European cultural, artistic, political, and economic rebirth following the Middle Ages. Generally described as taking place from the 14th century to the 17th century, the Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art. In Utopia, Thomas More contrasts the problem of the real world, such as poverty, crime, and political corruption, with the harmony, equality, and prosperity of utopian society, which suggests that More believes that at least some of the principles underlying utopian practices are noble, even if the practices themselves are far-fetched. In any case, in describing and critiquing utopian society, More gives new perspectives on the problems and strengths of his own society. Christopher Marlowe was an Elizabethan poet and William Shakespeare's most important predecessors in English drama. He is noted especially for his establishment of dramatic blank verse. In a playwriting career that spanned little more than 6 years, Marlowe's achievements were diverse and splendid. The Elizabethan age saw the flowering of poetry. The sonnet, the Spenserian stanza, dramatic blank verse was a golden age of drama, especially for the plays of Shakespeare, and inspired a wide variety of splendid prose, from historical chronicles, versions of the Holy Scriptures, pamphlets, and literary criticism to the first English novels. The Elizabethan theatres were built to entertain and excite English citizens in the early 16th century. The theatres specialized in the theatrical productions, those including satires, tragedies, comedies, and historical events. In order to revise the lecture, answer the given questions for self-checking. At the end of the lecture, you are given glossary on this theme. At the end, you are given references for further learning.